In this lecture, we will discuss the X-Men graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills and Cormac McCarthy's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Road through the lens of literary Darwinism. We will apply two key terms, one being the evolution of morality and the other group selection. Before we can get to morality and group selection, we have to get one very basic evolutionary term out of the way. That is mutation. While we're all familiar with the pop culture version of X-Men that we've seen in films and graphic novels and the like for many years, most often genetic mutations aren't quite so dramatic. Many of them aren't even visibly expressed in an individual. However, there are some that you can see very drastic changes. For example, Down syndrome, genetic blindness, being born without a limb. Those are some examples. And if you pause here and click the link to Singularity Hub, you can see a more recent example of a child that was born with eyes that allow him to see in the dark. So, as you read this X-Men graphic novel, keep in mind that it doesn't exactly follow with basic biology. However, I would like for you to consider whether or not there are biological mutations within the human genome today that could be considered advantageous. For example, my red hair is considered a mutant gene. If you watch Juan Enriquez, his TED Talk, you'll see some of the other mutant genes that exist in the human population today that allow for athletic prowess and the ability to climb mountains. It's also important to distinguish between cultural evolution and biological evolution and artificial selection as you read through these two novels. Cultural adaptation relies on modifications within an individual's lifespan that in order to fit the customs of a particular culture. Artificial selection is something that humans engage in quite consciously. All of the common domestic breeds of cats and dogs have been artificially selected by humans for particular traits. A certain eye or fur, a certain pattern of coloring, or a certain temperament. There have even been scientists who recently have used artificial selection to create a very pet-like fox species. In this particular area, they'd had issues with some ferocious foxes attacking people's dogs and small children in this small community. And so scientists came in and said they thought they could breed that ferocity out of the species in only a few generations. So they went about capturing some of these wild foxes and they began a breeding program. In only 8 generations, they were able to create a version of this fox that wags its tail when humans come in the room, that hops up on the sofa with you and acts as if it's a lap dog. They were also able to do the reverse and breed very, very ferocious foxes, so that when you step into the barn, they're all in these cages, they immediately start growling and barking, and they're so difficult to deal with that the humans can't even have direct contact with them anymore. So this is an example of how quickly these sorts of changes can occur in only a few generations when selected with a conscious pattern in mind. We do this in our own sexual selection. If you prefer a potential mate with a particular hair color or an eye color or a temperament, then you too are conducting artificial selection. Some scientists believe that morality is also something that has been created through evolution of the human species, and that we are hardwired to act in certain ways that enable us to survive and reproduce successfully. Think, for example, of the universal aversion to inbreeding. All of us would say, oh no, that's disgusting. A child with their parent or siblings, oh, that just makes me sick to my stomach to think about it. And from a genetic and an evolutionary standpoint, obviously this would be very a disadvantage to the human species and population. Inbreeding causes mutation, it causes a weakness in genes that can be very detrimental. Think, for example, of some of those pure-blooded dog breeds. We were talking about artificial selection earlier. Well, sometimes humans have inadvertently crossed lines and created some of those inbreeding mutations. Labs with hip dysplasia, for example. This is a result of that kind of inbreeding. So that's one example of a moral behavior that may be advantageous to our survival. Now we're going to play a thought experiment. This is what philosophers call it, when you imagine a scenario and try to propose possible solutions to that scenario. So the first scenario is this. There's a train barreling down the tracks, headed for 4 innocent people standing on the line. You alone have the power to flip a switch, diverting that train from killing those 4 people, but killing one other instead. Would you flip the switch? Pause here and think about it for a second. Now, most people would say, yes, I would flip that switch. Now, we can use our language to justify that reasoning in many different ways. Some people will say, well, it depends on who the people are. If the one person that could die if I flip that switch is a relative of mine, no, I wouldn't do it. Or if those 4 people were young and the one person was old, yes, I would. But the case is that most people will answer yes to that scenario. But let's try another one. Same scenario, only this time, here comes the train barreling down the tracks, 4 innocent people stand to die, and you can save them by pushing another individual in front of that train. Would you do it? Think about it. Pause here. So most people in this scenario will answer no. And they will use language to justify their decision in many different ways. So what scientists believe that study this idea of morality as something that we can inherit, that's hardwired into us like language, is that we have evolved a set of morals that keep us from causing direct personal harm, right? Thou shalt not. And that direct personal harm comes into play in that second scenario, where most people say, no, I wouldn't shove someone in front of that train, even if it meant I could save others. But we haven't yet evolved a morality from causing indirect harm. So flipping the switch, right, that would be indirect harm. We don't have to touch that person, we just have to flip the switch. So scientists propose that perhaps we have not yet evolved a system that allows us to be averse to causing that indirect harm. So I would like for you to think about the situations that occur in the X-Men graphic novel and also in Cormac McCarthy's The Road. See if you can discover some particular scenes in which characters are causing direct or indirect harm to others, and see if those characters are behaving in a way that would support this theory of a morality gene. Now here's another quote from Nicholas Wade of the New York Times in reference to this idea of the morality gene. Keep in mind that this is all still theory. It's under investigation and study. It's a relatively new area of inquiry, and we haven't yet isolated a gene that we could call the specific morality gene in the way that we have discovered FOXP2. So this is all still speculative at this point. However, he points out that when you think about natural selection and survival of the fittest in their most elemental forms, they seem to be very selfishly motivated. It's about the survival of the self, right? Doing all that you have to in order to survive. But we as humans live in groups, in a social structure. And again, evolution is nothing if not efficient. So there has to be some sort of evolutionary advantage to that kind of social structure, to that social living. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. Even though oftentimes when you're in a group like that, you have to sacrifice the self for the greater good of that group. So that's what's known as group selection. This is the theory that takes into account all of those pressures at different levels of organization. So not just looking at the individual and the gene, but looking at the multi-species community and the group. And so that's the way that we're going to approach X-Men and the Road, looking at it from this perspective of group selection. I mentioned earlier the idea that morality has an ancient sort of Pleistocene inherited kind of set of behaviors, and then a more modern one that developed out of language. We discussed that in the thought experiment, how we would use language to justify the choices and the decision we make in that thought experiment. And we also talked about inbreeding or incest as one of those things that are just instinctually repulsive to us. That moral intuition, as Wade refers to it here, is that gut reaction that just grosses us out. Some other examples are, causing harm to a child. Obviously, that's not helpful to evolution because you have to have offspring in order to perpetuate the species. Self-inflicted and suicide, again, detrimental to the species. Killing one another, direct harm, again, detrimental to the group, the species. So these are just a few quotes that talk about the ways in which that moral judgment can enhance survival, and the ways in which we've evolved sophisticated systems like our legal system, for example, or in the Bible, the commandments, using language to articulate why these sort of instinctual moral choices should be made. Dr. Haidt is one of our TED Talk professors, and he works in this area of morality and trying to begin to uncover some of these universal morals. And he talks about 5 that he believes are truly hardwired into us from birth. Preventing harm to oneself, right, the extreme of that being suicide. Reciprocity and fairness, that treating others the way you want to be treated, which would be helpful when living in a group or a society. Loyalty to the in-group. So if you're functioning in that society, you need to be loyal to your group in order to enhance their survival. Respect for authority and hierarchy. Again, in that social structure, there has to be a sense of someone in charge and someone that you would defer to as an authority. And then the last one is a sense of purity or sanctity. Now, these universal morals can affect behaviors in a positive way, but they can also have negative repercussions. So think about some of the situations in X-Men and The Road where that kind of loyalty to the in-group has disastrous consequences for those not within that group. Think about Hitler, for example. This was someone who commanded respect and authority within his in-group, and he used the rhetoric of purity and sanctity in order to justify the horrific things that he and his soldiers, the atrocities they committed, were done from a position where they felt they were being more morally righteous. So group selection can be a positive, but it can also have a negative effect, and it's important to look at these texts for both of those sides of group selection. Dr. Haidt also discusses quite a bit the emotion of disgust. He and other social psychologists have done lots of research about that knee-jerk gut reaction we have that evokes disgust. The facial pattern of disgust is universal. It's the nose scrunched up, that repulsion, the squinting of the eyes, a physical distancing, pushing your head back and away from the thing that is evoking that disgust. And that's a universal set of behaviors across all cultures. That's the way people react with disgust. An interesting experiment that was done recently at Duke University in relation to this. They had a clear glass of orange juice, and they asked the participants, do you like orange juice? And those that said yes, they said, well, we've got a great glass here just for you. And then the researcher takes out a cockroach. and he puts it on a clean piece of cloth, and he explains to the participant, this cockroach has been sterilized. It contains nothing bad. It